California. Until the 1850s, no light shone from these fabled shores where Amazon warriors carried swords of gold.
People are both in awe and in love with lighthouses.
I always had that weird feeling about the lighthouse.
Being here in this lighthouse on this beautiful island is a simple gift.
Without the lighthouses, we would have had untold wreckage all up and down the coast.
This is the end of America.
In December of 1856, the Battery Point Lighthouse first cast its beam from the craggy shores of Crescent City in the far north corner of the Golden State. The lighthouse is operated as a museum by the Del Norte County Historical Society.
Okay, before I send you upstairs to the tower, I'd like to show you a couple things.
Carol Vestal and her husband Don are modern-day lightkeepers.
What I want to point out is this gray pole, which is actually a hollow tube, and this is actually called the waitway. Through this, the keeper had to crank 200 pounds of weights from the basement to the base of the light every 8 hours. And as those weights lowered back through, it would turn the gears below the light. That kept that light rotating all night long and sending that flash of light out. Okay, so now I'd like to send you upstairs to Don and see the tower. You're welcome.
Don Vestal relishes his role as keeper.
Hi, how you people today? Good. Well, you're in Captain Pylan's dedicated room. He was our last lighthouse keeper, and when he left in 1953, it was turned over to the Historical Society, and it's been lived in continuously for about 140 years. Being a modern lighthouse keeper involves not as many chores as the old guys do that they had to do. I think the best part of it is meeting and dealing with the people. This is our bedroom. This is where Carol and I live. They always like our tours, and they kind of get into the old history that we get into with them, and they just kind of envelop themselves in this. And of course, Carol and I do too. The history just feels really good. We do tours to 10,000 people here each year, just Carol and I, in 6 months. Some people don't really believe that we live here. They think we're docents. And they say, do you actually live right in this lighthouse? I tell them, yep, that's my side of the bed and that's my teddy bear.
I certainly feel a lot of respect for the keepers' wives. I can't imagine Mrs. Jeffries out here for 4 years. She had a couple of babies born here in the lighthouse, going up and down those stairs. When you think of the old days, they didn't have lights to turn on. They were carrying maybe a candle and a baby up and down the stairs. Especially in this lighthouse, the lighthouse keeper's wife was the assistant keeper. It's fulfilling a fantasy I never thought I'd ever get to do. When the tide's out and the people are here, it's a lot of activity and fun. But when that tide comes in, it just makes for a lot of wonderful moments.
We sit outside and watch the sunset. Then, of course, we'll come into here and light the candles sometimes, play the Victrola with the old records, and just kind of walk through this place wondering what else happened here. Here we are, we're just a long line of people who have been and going to be in this lighthouse, and so we just sit here and just enjoy this. We just enjoy being alone and being in such a historic building, and it's all ours.
This may be the most legendary of all the legendary lighthouses. St. George Reef Light stands 2 miles offshore at a place once known as Dragon Rocks. It took 10 years to build. Construction costs approached $750,000. an astounding sum in 1892. During the light's working years, the turbulent seas claimed 5 lives. Bob Boland and Guy Towers share a dream of preserving the old lighthouse and returning it to some useful purpose.
In 1986, I was transferred to Crescent City, and just coincidentally, St. George Reef was up for sale by the federal government. And I began to ask questions around town to find out who would be interested in starting a preservation group up here. I contacted Bob Boland, and we put together a nonprofit organization. And after 10 years, we finally accomplished our goal of getting jurisdiction over the lighthouse.
Well, I grew up in Del Norte County during the Depression. Lighthouses were off limits, mysterious. St. George Reef Lighthouse is a jewel of lighthouses. See it from the beach was the other side of the world as far as I was concerned as a kid. Never really dreaming that I'd get out there.
Over the years, we came across some fabulous historic materials that showed what the lighthouse looked like on the inside, interviewed keepers and knew more about the lighthouse that way. And I was finally able to go out and land at the lighthouse with the Coast Guard. And it was almost like I was visiting an old friend.
We're in the engine room. Originally they had steam engines. They had to transport coal here for them. This is the galley. This is where they spent most of their time, did their cooking.
Our big challenge is stripping the paint off.
Now that we're going up to the crew's quarters, all this flooring has to come up. It's going to be quite a project. And finally we end up in the lantern room. The lantern room is our big problem because of the glass being busted. We've got to do something about that.
I think I described St. George as being the Mount Everest of lighthouses. There's no other lighthouse that matches it in the world. Because St. George is a wave-washed lighthouse that's exposed to the full brunt of the ocean and has taken a pounding from the Pacific Ocean for over 100 years. And it's as solid as the day it was built.
Halfway between San Francisco and the Oregon border lies California's Lost Coast, one of the most rugged and wild areas in the United States. The Cape Mendocino Lighthouse once stood as a proud sentinel, guarding the northern end of this untamed coast. This is as far west as you can go in California. 1,400 feet above the sea, it's the highest headland in the state. These haunting views will never be seen again. In the spring of 1998, the old light tower was moved. The restored structure will be displayed farther south at the town of Shelter Cove. A soulless, modern beacon reliably and automatically sends its light seaward. When it too finally outlives its purpose, will even the wind mourn its passing? The Point Cabrillo Light is perched on some of the most desirable acreage along the Mendocino County coast. It's a favorite spot for hikers, birders, nature lovers, and anyone seeking solitude. This beautiful light station has been protected and is being restored by the California Coastal Conservancy. Conservancy site manager Lisa Wegg has responsibility for the lighthouse and the 300-acre nature preserve that surrounds it.
This would have been a housing development of 55 new homes, and there was a lot of community concern about saving this last bit of undeveloped coastline and the light station. Now that we've set aside the money to preserve it from development, we're trying to restore the light station to keep it from falling apart. One of the things that's special about it is that you can walk down here and see what a turn-of-the-century light station looked like. If you can overlook the rust and the paint flakes, the buildings are little changed, and the undeveloped property around the light station looks much as it did when the lightkeepers kept their cattle and their sheep and raised potatoes and forage crops. I think that lighthouses are both a warning beacon and a signpost, and we all need those in our lives, and we're attracted to that symbology. But I think mostly people are attracted to the peace and the history, the stories, the adventure aspect of lightkeeping.
The 115-foot monolith at Point Arena is one of the tallest in California. Its light first shone in 1870. The devastating San Francisco earthquake of 1906 severely damaged the old light tower, and a new reinforced concrete tower replaced it. Bill Owens was keeper from 1937 to 1952. His 6 daughters spent their formative years here, and they often return for a family reunion. Diana, Shirley, and Sarah reminisce, a rare moment of living lighthouse history.
We had no television. We had a radio that we listened to once in a while, such as Inner Sanctum. And the day the war broke out, I know we were playing outside, and Dad called all of us in. And he sat us down to where we'd have to listen to the radio about Pearl Harbor. I look back on it, we had a very good life. And it's something that I wish somehow I could get back to it.
I think one thing about being raised on a lighthouse, though, all of us are somewhat loners, I think. We don't like to be, like in the
like
cities
this.
or crowds or anything like this. We're all somewhat loners.
We don't need a lot of people around us.
Yeah.
We make our own fun, our own entertainment. We still do today.
Oh, look at the sea lions on the...
Where?
Aren't the sea lions on the rocks out there? Yeah, they're one goes down.
And that was a nice sound to hear, too, when the sea lions were barking.
Yeah.
On that island up the road. Whenever I get, frustrated or stressed where I live right now, I go to the beach. There's nothing so calming as the waves coming in.
Especially when it's stormy. That's the best time to be out on the beach, so it's stormy.
And when the fog comes in, I used to love to sit in front of the fireplace with the foghorn going, and it's all white around you. It's just like you're covered with a blanket. It's beautiful.
And even the light coming through your bedroom window, every few seconds, it irritated a lot of people, I presume, but it was just very comforting.
My dad had taught us to turn the lighthouse on. We all had to do that. But it was just a job to us, and it was just our home, and I never thought about what it was doing for the ships or anything. It was just our life.
You don't realize the importance of it or the beauty of it until you got older and moved away from it.
We're going to hit the lottery, and then we're all going to go together and buy a lighthouse and live on it.
Right.
Just north of San Francisco, the 71,000 acres of Point Reyes National Seashore hosts more than 450 species of birds and 37 species of land mammals. The sheltered cove near the lifeboat station in Drake's Bay is a safe haven for fishermen of all species. The Marine Mammal Center is one of the largest and most unusual wild animal hospitals in the world. The center rescues, rehabilitates, and releases hundreds of distressed marine mammals each year. The quiet waters at Chimney Rock Beach are a favored release site. Aaron Frank, Guthrum Purdon, and Rebecca Dewar are volunteers whose love for the animals transcends occasional danger or discomfort.
We just released 3 elephant seals and 2 sea lions, and these 5 animals were stranded on the Central California coast. They were treated at our hospital, and all were healthy enough to be released, so today they got to go home.
We help them as much as we can until they're back up to a good weight, till their wounds have been treated, or their parasites, whatever, have been taken care of. Then we release them.
A lot of times we're up in the middle of the night and very cold and wet, and it's still an interesting, rewarding thing to do.
I originally started working with the marine mammals because it would seem to me to be a very adventurous and exciting thing to do. But over the past 10 years that I've been working with them, I've really found it that I just really love these animals. That's it for me, to be able to really work with these animals and to be able to spend some of my life with them.
So treacherous are the waters around Point Reyes that there were 46 shipwrecks recorded in the 60 years after the lighthouse began operation. Each evening before sunset, a lightkeeper would have to descend these 300 steps to light the oil lamps that illuminated the lantern. The old lighthouse was retired in 1975. The Park Service has preserved it as a tribute to the romantic era of lightkeepers and beautiful yet functional craftsmanship.
This is where we stand, right here at Point Reyes.
Park Ranger Brian Aptekar conducts a moonlight tour of the lighthouse.
Runs parallel here with Tamales Bay. Basically, if you're going up and down the coast, this sticks 10 miles out into your way. And we're known for fog. This is the foggiest point on the west coast, the windiest point on the west coast. It's quite an obstacle. There have been many a ship that have wrecked right here. In the first couple years of the gold rush, some 700 ships came towards the bay, but because of fog, because of topography, because of the Farallones, about half of them wrecked in the Bay Area before getting to port in San Francisco. Light bulbs went off in people's heads. Maybe we need a lighthouse. As we go down the stairs, I want you to imagine what life would be like out on this windy, foggy place, that it's a time tunnel, and we're walking back in time to 1870 when this was first built, and you're coming to apply for the job of lighthouse keeper. So you can imagine walking down this in like thick fog and just holding on. Sometimes they'd have to crawl back up, it was so windy. The Coast Guard gave the historic light to the Park Service because we are an agency that preserves historic structures and interprets the history for everybody. The Coast Guard has a completely different mission, and giving tours isn't part of that. So let's step back inside if we could. It's a little less windy and probably easier to hear and warmer too. Here at Point Reyes, you can see, barely, we're sticking out into the coast, it'll say FL5 sec. That's our address. Flashing 1 every 5 seconds. So, how do you make a lighthouse flash every 5 seconds? We've got 24 panels of glass. The source of light from inside isn't focused yet. It's just a light. It could be an oil-burning wick, it could be kerosene, it could be an electric bulb. But basically, it's a general light source. Each vertical panel focuses the light from within. What you have is 24 beams of light, like giant spokes on a wagon wheel. It isn't flashing every 5 seconds, though. What do we need to do? In this case, what they did was spin the lens, the whole 6,000 pounds of it, sitting on these little brass chariot wheels, spun around at just the right speed so that as one of those beams turned and passed your eyes at sea, it appeared that it flashed every 5 seconds. Now you've got the source of light going like it is now, shining out through those lenses, creating beams of light outside. Now comes the hard part. You have to crank up the weight. There's a 175-pound weight hanging on this cable there. The weight of that on the cable is pulling on the mechanism right inside here. The cable is pulling on the drum is turning the whole mechanism. There's 1,032 pieces of glass, a whole lot of brass and metal, and it takes just 2 fingers to get it going. A little nudge, and it starts spinning.
Point Bonita Light, on the Marin headlands of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, guards the northern entrance to San Francisco Bay. Since 1877, it has warned sailors off the rocks and beckoned them to the earthly delights of Baghdad by the Bay. John Martini, the park's curator of military history, was a supervisor at the lighthouse for 5 years and worked with the Coast Guard on its restoration.
It isn't the biggest lighthouse, it's not the oldest lighthouse, but it sure is probably one of the most dramatic lighthouses on the California coast. This is the end of America. Some lighthouses I like because of the technology and the history that's there, the architecture. Some lighthouses really speak to you because of their location. When you walk out to Point Bonita, you feel you're really going to about as remote a site as you can be on and still be physically on North America. Next stop are offshore rocks. When you're out here, you feel that you're very small. The ocean, the wind, the waves, erosion, those are the powers that are in charge. When you're out there and you're snug in that brick tower, all you have to do is look out through the windows and realize how puny these efforts are, yet how important.
Wayne Wheeler founded the United States Lighthouse Society, a nonprofit historical and educational organization.
I was in the Coast Guard as an officer and a civilian for years, and I'm very much in tune with our maritime history, and I also am fascinated with architecture. One thing about the California lighthouses is that they had the Fresnel lens from the beginning. The first 16 lighthouses, all built between 1854 and 1860 by the outbreak of the Civil War, were all similar in design. They're basically a story-and-a-half Cape Cod-style house with a tower through the middle. The contractor had a choice to either construct them out of brick, granite, or rubble stone, whichever was prevalent in the area. I think one of the most charming things about lighthouses is some of the detail. I think when most people think of federal buildings, they think of great gray slabs, impersonal structures created for efficiency. Lighthouses are different. They're federal structures for sure, but they have personal touches on them, or whimsy or warmth, such as gargoyles for rain spouts on the dome of the lantern rooms, or gingerbread on the redwood lighthouses constructed in California. And of course, lighthouses being part of our maritime past, they are a symbol of the sailor coming home, of safe passage. To some, they're religious. They point to the sky, they're the light against the darkness. They're that picket fence along the coast, the fence between terra firma, although not so firma out here, and that dangerous sea that covers 3/4 of the earth.
Alcatraz Island, notorious prison home of Al Capone and the Birdman, had humble beginnings as a guano-encrusted pelican rookery. The Rock is one of the city's most popular tourist attractions. The U.S. government saw it as a strategic site and located California's first lighthouse here. Park ranger and author John Martini has researched and written extensively about the history of Alcatraz.
In January of 1848, gold was discovered. When word got out, as one historian put it, the world rushed in and San Francisco exploded. It was a town of shacks and tents and gambling halls and drunk 20-somethings. It averaged several murders a night. Ships were coming into San Francisco and the crews were jumping ship and heading for the gold fields. It was insanity. And in the middle of all this, the U.S. government was tasked with trying to defend this madhouse and protect those ships coming in. This island was recognized early on as a giant hazard to navigation. Sitting right in the middle of San Francisco Bay, all shipping in and out of the harbor had to go around this rock, or in many unfortunate cases, they hit it right by accident. So when the U.S. government laid out its recommendations for lighthouses right at the start of the gold rush, #1 priority was given to that giant hazard in the center of San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz Island. Almost simultaneous with the lighthouse being built, the Army fortified the slopes of Alcatraz with hundreds and hundreds of gun emplacements to fight off any bad guys that might try to take over San Francisco. It also seemed logical to send prisoners here. If they were doing hard time, they might as well do hard time on a hard place, and Alcatraz was that place. So pretty soon the little Cape Cod lighthouse was surrounded not only by gun batteries, but a growing number of prison buildings along the perimeter of the island. A huge cell house below us was constructed using convict labor. And it was such a massive building that pretty soon it towered over the little 1850s lighthouse. So the lighthouse board built the tower that we're standing on to get the light higher than the growing prison building.
Yerba Buena, or Goat Island, is another of the navigational hazards in San Francisco Bay. The lighthouse was built in 1874 and automated in 1958. Walter Fanning has acclaimed the lighthouse that few, if any, can share. Here, his life began.
The house over my shoulder was originally the keeper's quarters. Two families lived in it, one downstairs and one upstairs. I was born in the upstairs quarters in 1909. My grandfather was the assistant keeper here at Yerba Buena Island. And when the keeper's position at East Brother Island was vacated, he was promoted to keeper up there. My granddad was there from 1914 to 21 for 7 years. And I imagine we visited twice a year there. And I have very fond memories of the place.
Walter Fanning has played a key role in the preservation and restoration of this classic Victorian light station.
In February 1980, we started the restoration of the island. The place was in terrible condition. We took our woodworking machines out there and rebuilt the Victorian scrimshaw work that was on the building. In addition to that, we reconditioned the fog signal and got it operating again.
Guests at the East Brother Light Station Inn experience a sound that has long been silenced on the San Francisco Bay. A mere 40 pounds of air pressure generates a bellow that even Godzilla would envy.
It was a surprise birthday present for my husband, Paul.
I'm on the Landmarks Board for the City of San Francisco, and I'm an architect, and part of my practice is historic buildings.
I tend to try to stay in unique areas and places, so this certainly qualifies as someplace that's pretty unique.
John and Laura really take care of you, and you feel like it's a special experience because they do.
Lori Hogan and her husband, John Barnett, share the wide variety of innkeeping duties.
Being an innkeeper out here at East Brother Light Station definitely has its rewards in that I derive a lot of self-satisfaction from having people come out here and having a good time and cooking the 4-course dinner and giving them a tour.
The lighthouse here was built in 1873 by the United States Lighthouse Service. 2 families lived and worked out here, and that's the reason for the staircase that's outside in front of the house. The house was built and run as a duplex. The Coast Guard manned the station until 1969. For 10 years, the house was vacant. At that point, a non-profit organization was formed to try to save the place from being torn down. And in 1980, they came up with the idea of running it as a bed and breakfast to continue to generate revenue to keep it maintained. And that's basically where it stands today.
Working out here as a couple for John and myself has worked out really well. Luckily, we're pretty good friends. I don't know if it would work out well for all couples. When they hire a couple out here, they're looking for kind of an odd combination of qualifications. One of the persons in the couple has to have a Coast Guard ocean operator's license. And in addition to that, the couple obviously has to be willing to do all the other things involved, cooking dinners and breakfast. There's kind of a romantic allure, I think, for a lot of people that lighthouses have. And this one in particular, since it's on an island and kind of in a remote setting, is kind of a really romantic spot.
We have 2 little babies that are about 2 years old now, and this is our first romantic night away since 2 years.
I do have my pager and my cell phone, and we have called and talked to the nanny a couple of times to make sure everything is fine.
The lighthouse is only a short boat ride from the shore, yet it's an island in time for those fortunate enough to visit. The graceful building evokes a rose-colored era when life seemed simple and architecture was complicated. Ralph and Lisa Wu Shanks have written several books about Bay Area lighthouses and lifeboat stations. Ralph's interest dates back to early childhood visits to the lighthouse at Crescent City.
The Pacific Ocean is the largest geographical feature in the world.
It's larger than the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean and the Great Lakes combined. It produces the world's largest storm waves and the largest tsunamis. And so you had to have lighthouses that matched that ocean's grandeur and that ocean's strength. California's classic lighthouses tend to be short and powerful. They tend to be built on high headlands, so there's no need for them to be really high. And at the same time, since there are great distances from one harbor to another, you needed usually powerful first or second order lenses.
Each station was really like a small village where everyone had to do their own farming. They had to raise their own animals. They had to bring in teachers to educate their children. And it was really a very isolated lifestyle, but also very self-contained.
Just a short distance south of San Francisco, travelers on a limited budget may enjoy an overnight lighthouse experience at Point Montara Light Station. The facility is managed by Hosteling International, a worldwide network of low-cost travel accommodations. Rich Lilly was first attracted to this coast by its natural beauty and totally awesome surfing spots.
I've been the manager of the hostel at the Point Montara Lighthouse since 1980, and it was a kind of exciting program. We were a pilot project for the state parks system of California, and we were the first to open as a hostel to use old historical buildings, especially the lighthouse. Basically, the hostel's open to recreational travelers. We have family accommodations or dorm-style accommodations. We have a couple of kitchens, laundry, telephone, and a nice shared experience for everyone. There's everything from whale watching to fishing to sea kayaking, surfing. There's lots of great hikes in the area here. The coastal range comes into the ocean about 2 miles north of here. You can hike from sea level up to 2,000 feet for the day, and you can see the whole Bay Area. We also try to give the guests the experience of the weather, the ships going by, the whales, the seals, the pelicans. It's just a real exciting place for people to be.
North of Santa Cruz, the classic Seacoast Tower at Pigeon Point remains basically unchanged since its construction in 1872. The 115-foot structure was erected with bricks brought around Cape Horn from the east. The tower was beautifully restored by the Coast Guard and is open to scheduled public tours. Budget overnight lodging is available at the hostel that occupies the keepers' houses.
People are both in awe and in love with lighthouses because it takes them back to that kinder and gentler era that we all think was kinder and gentler, but when we study the actual workings of the lighthouse keeper, why, here at Pigeon Point we tend to explode that myth. It was not an easy job, and it was always one that kept you busy.
Nelson Morosini is an interpretive specialist for the California State Parks.
Keepers stood the 4-hour watch in the watch room at the level just below the lantern room, and of course they had to light the lamp, which took the better part of an hour by the time they had all the wicks lit off and trimmed and the storm panes cleaned on the outside. During the day, there was maintenance work. There was brass to be polished. There were lanterns to be disassembled and cleaned. There was always something happening here in the lighthouse. The best story we have here is the ghost story. Sarah Coburn was the wife of Lauren Coburn, who at one time owned this property. He was unanimously disliked by the locals in Pescadero. Ultimately, Lauren Coburn probably sued or got sued by everybody in San Mateo County, died in Pescadero and was mourned by no one, with the possible exception of his wife Sarah. One morning, Sarah Coburn was found brutally murdered in her home. Blood on the walls, a blood-stained 2x4. But an autopsy was done on Sarah. Her organs were stored in the physician's office, and soon thereafter her stomach turned up missing before it could be tested. And the story goes that when the fog is in at night here at Pigeon Point and you look up at the lantern, it's not unusual for you to see the image of Sarah Coburn on the lantern room outside, looking toward Pescadero, possibly looking for the person or persons unknown who sent her to her death. Or possibly she may be just looking for her lost stomach.
The incredibly rich marine environment of Monterey Bay attracts both sea creatures and the scientists, fishermen, and tourists who come to see them. Cannery Row and its collection of colorful characters served up a feast for the imagination of John Steinbeck. The Monterey Bay Aquarium and its prestigious research institute are fostering a new awareness of mankind's connection to the sea and obligation to preserve it as a healthy environment. Point Pinos is the oldest continuously operating lighthouse on the West Coast. The original Fresnel lens was first lit in 1855. Automated in 1975, it continues to light the way to Monterey Bay. The lighthouse has been lovingly restored by the Pacific Grove Museum of Natural History and the Adobe chapter of the Questers. Emily Fish, the social light keeper, arrived at Point Pinos in the summer of 1893 with her Chinese servant, Q. The extraordinary Mrs. Fish quickly learned the duties of a lightkeeper and then set out to civilize the light station with books, art, silver, crystal, and crisp linens. At the age of 71, after 21 years of exceptional service in a job usually reserved for men, Emily handed the keys of the lighthouse to her successor. Retired merchant seaman Bruce Handy is well versed in the history and lore of Point Pinos and its most famous keeper.
Emily Fish, she was a very outstanding lady. She had an outstanding record here, 3-star record, inspected every 30 days by the chief inspector. But she hired and fired 32 assistants for inefficiency. She was very demanding. She entertained quite extensively here. Sea captains, famous people, politicians. Every Sunday between 2 and 4, she had high tea. She was quite a lady.
Way and up she rises early in the morning. What'll we do when it's fog and storming? What will we do when it's fog and storming? What'll we do when it's fog and storming early in the morning? Light up the lighthouse in the warning.
Hotel owner Miles Williams was once the lead singer with the New Christie Minstrels.
Early in the morning.
Sur means south, means it's the south coast, and they call it Big because when you drive down to Big Sur, when you get right into the middle of Big Sur, you'll see these cliffs that drop right off into the sea. It's incredibly dramatic.
Big Sur people are quite vocal in their objection to change. The Post Ranch project was no exception.
There have been such beautiful pieces of land along the coastline that have fallen into the hands of insensitive developers who just want to do whatever they can to get it developed. So we thought, well, before it falls into the hands of someone insensitive, why don't we build a hotel there? We went through a couple of architects, came up with Mickey Munig, and Mickey lived out there on that ridge for 2 weeks in a tent and came back with his drawings and said, I don't think we'll have to cut any trees. And we said, well, that's unusual. How's that? And he said, well, I think we can build triangular units and round units, and we can wedge the triangles into the redwood forest, build them on pilings, and not disturb the root systems of the shallow-rooted redwood trees, and I think it'll work. And so I took the drawings and showed them to some hotel friends, and they said, why, you can't get furniture to go in those units. It's going to cost you a fortune to do that. And besides, those triangles, the corners are so tight you can't even walk into the corners. So I told Mickey, I said, hey, they said you can't even walk into the corners, Mickey. He said, well, Miles, when was the last time you walked into a corner? And I thought that was about right. And we decided to go ahead with the project, and it worked out very nicely.
Holly Fassett was raised in Big Sur after her parents bought the property that became the fabled Nepenthe restaurant. After a life of raising a family and working hard at the eatery, Holly has delightedly discovered her artistic side.
My parents had actually bought it from Rita Hayworth and Orson Welles. They wanted to build a hamburger stand or a hot dog stand down on the highway, but the local people didn't want that, so my mom said, well, let's build it up in the back where we get the beautiful view and nobody will see it from the highway. Everybody in my family, I felt like, except me, was very flamboyant and very artistic. I mean, we grew up around a lot of artistic people, very, like, really free spirits. You know, Henry Miller and Emil White, and just all kinds of people that were pretty far out. My mother always called them rugged individualists. When I was going to school, we'd get up and get on the school bus and drive down the coast and stop at the various bus stops, and one of them was at the Lighthouse. And I always remember thinking I wouldn't want to live there, though, because there's it's a very different climate. Even though it's in Big Sur, it's usually very windy there, and sometimes very mysterious, and sometimes, like, it's just incredible. Like, it'll be clear everywhere else, but there'll just be this incredible fog that's just drifted around like a cotton covering all around the lighthouse, and you can't even see it. But now, oh my God, it just takes my breath away. It's so incredibly beautiful. And just the way the shadows fall within the crevices and the different colors of it, and the way the ocean on one side is a different color than the other. And I've painted it many times, and I just feel like I want to paint it forever.
Point Sur sits on a monstrous rock on the wild Big Sur coast. Docent Jackie Pappas is a volunteer member of the Central Coast Lightkeepers.
You may have noticed that the outside of this lighthouse is square, and the inside here is round. One of the reasons is because this beautiful stairway came around Cape Horn on a sailing ship. Now, it didn't come all put together just like this. It came in pieces. And because back when it was made, things were made by hand, they wanted to make sure that the stanchions would fit into the nuts that would fit into the stand plates. So what they did was they numbered each of them. So you can see through the coats and coats of paint that this is number 6, which goes with stanchion number 6, which goes with stand plate number 6. They did that all the way up so that they had the proper radius that would fit this handrail on it. If someone is sailing past at night and they don't know where they are, the light has what we call a characteristic, so that every 15 seconds you will see a bright flash from the light. Someone looking again in the coastal light list will understand that it's Point Sur that they are off of, because no other lighthouse along this section of the coast will have that same flashing characteristic.
May I speak of those moments after sunrise, when the mist is rising from the sea and the fog is fingering the canyons of Big Sur. Each day lies before us, guarding our lasting plans for continuity.
Margaret Wentworth Owings is a selfless defender of wilderness. The founder of several conservation organizations, she has received numerous honors for her tireless work.
There's something interesting about Big Sur that puts people in their place in life. And many of them aren't even aware that they're not in their place, or that they've never tasted their own place in life. these mountains roll into the sea and the water goes out to infinity, and there's such variables. People who come here, it just becomes something they have to come back to again because it's done something to them. The natural world has been important to me since I was a small child. So I was born with this thing. And then when someone gave me Schweitzer to read when I was 10 years old, I just thought, here's a man who believes just the way I do. Each morning when I awake and swing my feet over the bed and look down the coast, it comes over me again and again at the privilege of living here and how grateful I am for this day. But with this privilege comes a responsibility. Each one of us should have and sense the responsibility that lies with us to guard not only wildlife but growing things and the great immensity and perspective of this coast.
The Point Vicente Light marks the northern approach to Los Angeles Harbor. A relative newcomer, the 67-foot tower was built in 1926. For years, there were reports of a ghostly lady wandering the grounds in search of her lover who had been lost at sea. A clever assistant keeper put the lady to rest when he concluded that her arrival coincided with light refracted from the lens, meeting small patches of fog. This lighthouse is unique in California for its third-order bivalve or clamshell lens. The lens was built in Paris in 1886. It served in Alaska for 40 years before its arrival in Southern California. The Port of Los Angeles is one of the busiest container terminals in the world. It handles nearly 3,000 ship arrivals a year. 30 million tons of cargo are loaded for and unloaded from all points of the globe. A fishing fleet and thousands of pleasure craft also rely on the harbor's aids to navigation. The Angels Gate Lighthouse marks the narrow entrance to the harbor channel. Since 1913, the lighthouse has endured storms, earthquakes, and a collision with a battleship. The Point Fermin Lighthouse was the first to show the way to the Port of Los Angeles on San Pedro Bay. The house was built in 1874 with materials brought around Cape Horn. It is one of the few remaining gingerbread lighthouses. Bill Olison and John Olguin are the sparks that ignited the movement to restore Point Fermin.
The telephone rang one day, and the fellow said, "John Olguin?" I said, "Yep." He said, "If you tell anybody that I called you, I'll get fired. I'm a civilian employee for the United States Coast Guard. And I just found out they're going to come in and overnight bulldoze down the Point Fermin Lighthouse." And I said, "Oh, my dead body." I sat down and I wrote a letter immediately. 2 days later, it came out in the paper. When Bill Olson read about my interest in the lighthouse, he came down to the museum and he said, "I'm a shipbuilder and I'm interested in taking out that chicken coop off that lighthouse and rebuilding it the way it was." I said, "So am I." So we formed a Point Fermin Lighthouse Committee. We shook hands. And from that moment on, we had breakfast once a week at 7 o'clock in the morning, and we planned and schemed how we could restore the Point Fermin Lighthouse.
I started going to sea with my father when I was 2 years of age. I early learned the importance of lighthouses for the aid of navigators, and one of the reasons why my dad's ship would come home safely from one place or the other, thanks certainly in part to the lighthouses. To me, it is a noble structure that's designed for the protection and safety of mankind at sea, and especially the sailors. Lord bless them, even if they're sinners. I claim they're very religious because I grew up
listening to a lot of profanity aboard ship when things were going wrong, and I noticed that it was amazing how often they called on God to correct the situation. But they recognized that there's a power, a greater power that's governed what's going on this little spinning sphere of Earth.
The lighthouse building has been restored, but its heart has not. The point firm and lens remains in private hands.
We still do not have the light back. It's on display and it's in the public eye, but I'd like to see that light back in the Point Firm Lighthouse before Bill goes to heaven. He is 94 years old. He's not going to live to be 194. And more than anything else in the world, I pray that somehow the good Lord will see to it that that light comes back home where it belongs. And when it does, folks, we're going to have the biggest party you're ever going to see in San Pedro. We're going to dance in the street. We're going to have the band out here. We're going to have everybody celebrating the fact that San Pedro, since 1874, had this lens that came from France, and it's now going to be installed where it belongs, on top of the Point Firm Lighthouse.
The Harbor Lights collection is one of the phenomena of the current interest in lighthouse memorabilia. The finely crafted miniatures have found a niche in the highly competitive gift business. Bill Younger is the founder and CEO of Harbor Lights.
A steel rod. Okay. I personally had a very great love from childhood for lighthouses. It was my intent to create a line of lighthouses and put them on the market. It was easier thought of, however, than it was bringing it to fruition. We were told constantly there's not enough interest in lighthouses, therefore we're not interested in spending the money to create a new product to bring it to market. We were so convinced that lighthouses would not be popular that by doing a limited edition, we felt it had a better chance. It's exceeded our wildest imaginations. We are truly running, and we need skateboards to try to keep up with the demand for the product. We do like to say to people that if you were holding a Harbor Lights piece in your hand next to that actual lighthouse, that you would recognize without a doubt that this is a small replica of that building, instead of just a lighthouse that looks somewhat similar and has a name on it.
The old Point Loma Lighthouse is located on the crest of Point Loma in San Diego's Cabrillo National Monument. The frequently fog-enshrouded cottage-style lighthouse was replaced by this new skeletal steel structure in 1891. The tower was built for strength, not for style. The lens originally ordered for the lighthouse was delayed due to the manufacturer's wish to show it at expositions in Paris and Chicago. A substitute lens was found, and the prize winner stayed in Chicago. Together, these lighthouses show the extremes of lighthouse design. The last keeper here served from 1875 to 1891. The Park Service has carefully refurnished 4 rooms of the lighthouse to appear as they did more than 100 years ago. Ceramic painting was a popular pastime for 19th century ladies. This shell-framed picture is from the lighthouse family's own collection and may have been done by the keeper's wife. In September of 1542, the Portuguese navigator Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo stepped ashore at San Diego to become the first European to set foot in what is now California. Cabrillo would go on to explore 800 miles of coastline without benefit of charts or the warning flash of a lighthouse. The monument to Cabrillo is a testament to all the brave sailors who venture onto unknown seas in pursuit of something so ephemeral as a dream. The coastal Pacific Northwest is an untamed wilderness where a tangle of tranquil ancient forests creeps to the edge of the turbulent sea. The lighthouses of Oregon and Washington were once vital to navigation along this rugged coast.
The age-old question of where am I is very important for mariners. So location, location, location is everything.
Oh, the friendliest thing you can see is a lighthouse when you've been days or weeks or months at sea.
The lighthouses of the Pacific Northwest continue to serve coastal mariners and are a popular attraction for visitors.
Well, looks like we eat tonight.
The shores of Cape Flattery are a forbidding wilderness maze at the northwesternmost corner of the lower 48 United States. All ships bound for the Canadian ports of British Columbia or the U.S. ports of Washington through the gateway Strait of Juan de Fuca must pass this treacherous headland. The Cape Flattery Lighthouse is located just offshore on Tatoosh Island. This lonely outpost still serves as a vital aid to ships entering the straits. Like most contemporary lighthouses, Cape Flattery is unmanned. The days of polished brass and white glove inspections are over, but maintenance of the light remains a high priority. A Coast Guard Aids to Navigation team has been dispatched on an urgent mission to investigate mariners' reports of unusual flashes coming from the lighthouse. The guardsmen are prepared to take any measures necessary to ensure the reliability of the light. Chief Jay Franklin and his team quickly discover the source of the problem and take immediate action to correct it. A new rotating beacon is creating reflections on the lantern room glass. Navigators depend on a light's unique flash to determine their position. An erroneous or confusing signal could have disastrous results for ships at sea. The solution may seem extreme, but it's simple and effective. The black paint will eliminate the misleading reflections. The light's red sector warns ships away from hazardous rocks. It must be carefully checked for accurate alignment.
We're determining that what we're putting in the light list and on this chart is what we're also showing, what we're advertising, as we call it. If you happen to be a boat and you're bearing in on this light, you'll see the red on here. And that tells a mariner that if you stay on this course, that there is rocks in the way. People's lives depend on us being as accurate as we can, to the point where, you just double check yourself several times just to make sure that what you're doing is as accurate as it can possibly be.
Piece of bottle glass, blue piece of plastic. Plastic? Yeah. Where'd it go? God, those guys were more advanced than we thought.
For centuries before the lighthouse was built on Tatoosh, Native Americans used the island as a summer fishing camp. Gary Wesson and Mike Hunter are searching for artifacts of the Makah tribe, who were occupants of the island for more than 1,000 years.
The Makah people were heavily involved in offshore hook and line fishing and offshore marine mammal hunting for fur seal, for whale. They fished halibut to a very great extent. And the limited archaeology that has been done here documents pretty sustained use of this area back at least 1,000 years. Much of the outer margin of the island appears to be relatively undisturbed, and that creates archaeological opportunities that we don't see on the mainland too often. This soil here is all part of the cultural deposit here. there would be fish bone in it, there may be bone tools in it, there would be probably fire-cracked rock in it. These people didn't have clay pots, but they made wooden boxes and cedar bark baskets that were watertight. They actually were able to boil water in wooden boxes, which is a pretty good trick. You heat stones in a fire, you get them real hot, and then you pick up these hot rocks with wooden tongs and you drop them in a box full of water. And you can heat the water real well, but you get this very rapid contraction, cooling of the rocks, and it makes them explode, which actually must have made mealtime kind of interesting.
By the 1930s, a full-time community of around 40 people was thriving on Tatoosh. In addition to the lighthouse, a weather station and a U.S. Navy radio compass facility were established on the tiny island. The little community had a post office and a schoolhouse where 17 children attended classes. In 1966, the weather station was closed. 10 years later, the lighthouse was automated and the families left. Nature began to reclaim the island. Modern technology has rendered the old lighthouse and its traditions obsolete. Solar panels supply power, photocells turn the light on and off, and a radio transmitter signals trouble. The joyful cries of the island's children are echoed only in the raucous calls of gulls. For ships bound east through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the new Dungeness Lighthouse is an important marker. The lighthouse warns of the 8-mile-long Dungeness Spit, a low-lying obstacle that is nearly impossible to see from the water. The light's a comforting presence for local fishermen, too. Jack Collins has worked these waters for more than 20 years. He's after the crab that shares its name with the lighthouse, the delicious Dungeness.
They're probably one of the finest eating seafood around. They're a lot more tasty and a lot sweeter meat than the king crab or the snow crab. Yeah, about 20 years ago I lost my brains, I guess. You have to be half crazy to be a fisherman anyway, so. But sure beats working for a living. At least you get to go for a boat ride every day. Lots of times in the fog we'll be able to hear the foghorn and also the light. It helps us considerably too. There's lots of people like me that are running in small boats, and we really need it. If you do get into trouble, you can go ahead and beach your boat and know that somebody's going to be there, other than some empty buildings.
In this case, that somebody standing watch at the lighthouse is the new Dungeness chapter of the U.S. Lighthouse Society. The volunteer group has maintained the lighthouse since the Coast Guard withdrew the last keeper in 1994.
A lot of us have a passion for history. This gave us both a challenge and an opportunity to really do something to preserve the past. We took the boarding down from the windows and made it look alive again.
Eric Henriksen is one of the chapter's founders. Mara Mowry is the acting president.
Since being involved with the new Dungeness Light, I've discovered that there's a whole lot of people who love lighthouses, are into lighthouses every which way.
Our members are delighted to pay the modest sum that we charge them to stay out here. There are some who simply want to be out here for a week of solitude. There are others who love to work on projects. There are others who just really get a kick at guiding visitors around. There is something for every kind of personality out here.
To be a keeper out here, you have to be a chapter member. We have members from Canada. We even have one membership in England. We've got them from all across the states. It's not just local folks who belong to the chapter, and that's most gratifying. There's so many people who want to kind of leave their mark here too. They want to do something, be it they can say, well, gee, I painted the fence, or I painted the steps to the lighthouse, or, you know, I did this, that, or the other. I guess it's more fun to maintain somebody else's house sometimes than your own.
We polished all the brass, took the fittings apart. We haven't been given a new work list. We got 3 more days, so I'm sure they'll have something for us.
Another job done?
Yep. We work about, 5, 6 hours a day, and the rest of the time, hey, you relax. And I guess every group that comes out does the same thing. And we fight to get out here.
The New Dungeness Lighthouse is very much a part of the history of the peninsula. Whether you're a tourist driving in on the peninsula, you can look out and see the light, or if you're cruising on the straits here, you look out and here's that light blinking at you. Believe me, it's a welcome sight to see the New Dungeness light still working.
Seattle, Washington is an ultra-modern city that is on the cutting edge of trends in music, retailing, computer software, and coffee. It is also an important seaport hub for the inland U.S., the Pacific Rim, and a maritime gateway to Canada and Alaska. The narrow passage of the Strait of Juan de Fuca funnels the goods of the world to Seattle's doorstep and enriches the local and national economies. Seattle is located on the shores of picturesque Puget Sound. This spectacular patchwork of islands and peninsulas, separated by skeins of passages and reaches, stretches for nearly 100 miles from Admiralty Inlet to Olympia. 2 lighthouses mark the entrance to Elliott Bay and the Port of Seattle. Ships heading in from the Pacific make their turn to the port at West Point Lighthouse. In 1872, the Lighthouse Board anticipated more vessel traffic to Seattle and recommended the placement of a lighthouse here. The first fog signal at West Point was a massive bell that once had its own tower. The station at West Point was automated in 1985, ending Washington's era of lightkeepers. The old keepers' quarters still house Coast Guard personnel. Alki Point Lighthouse marks the southern approach to Seattle's harbor entrance. Ships headed north from Tacoma make their turn to the starboard here. Because of its proximity to Seattle and the pleasant living quarters, Alki Point was a desirable station for keepers. In addition to their role as marine highways, the waters of Puget Sound are a playground for the shoreline cities of Seattle and Tacoma. The area offers endless recreational opportunities and several publicly accessible lighthouses. Ted and Charlene Nelson frequently sail the waters of Puget Sound. Their 3 books on lighthouses cover the West Coast from Cape Flattery, Washington, to Point Loma, California.
How's my depth there, Charlene?
The Nelsons' appreciation of lighthouses comes from their knowledge of basic seamanship and an understanding of the fine art of coastal navigation.
We have a compass, but we don't carry a radar, and so we've always liked to see lighthouses. They're always in view as we sail, and they're nice to see when you come out of the fog. The lighthouses in Puget Sound generally were built on relatively low towers with small lenses with lights that could be seen about 12 or 15 miles. So it was almost like street lights along the road, and the mariners then were able to clear those points. This is the Point Robinson Lighthouse. It was a principal turning point as ships came down from Seattle headed for Tacoma. It's the only lighthouse station in Washington that began with just a fog signal.
Well, welcome to Point Robinson Lighthouse. I'm Norm Nyheis, and this is John Toma. We're from Flotilla 32 of the Coast Guard Auxiliary, and we're your tour guides for the day.
Now, the station was not originally built as a lighthouse, but was built as a fog signal station without a light. With the increasing traffic between Seattle and Tacoma, the Lighthouse Service decided it was time to replace the whole site with a Class 1 lighthouse, which is what we have here now.
This particular lamp is very similar to the lamp that originally powered the light upstairs. It ran on kerosene. A gallon of kerosene would last between 6 and 8 hours, and that's why lighthouse keepers are always in shape and skinny little guys from carrying gallon jugs of kerosene up those 40 steps, probably twice a night to keep it going. Well, John will take you upstairs to show you the real star of our show, which is our 5th order Fresnel lens. It's quite frankly irreplaceable and absolutely priceless. So, it's a spiral staircase, 40 steps to the top. Don't worry if you get dizzy going up, because you can unwind on the way back down again.
The lens itself is made out of hand-cast, hand-polished French glass, and it's all set into a handmade brass frame. Nowadays, we have replaced the kerosene lamp with a 500-watt quartz iodine bulb. The lens is visible from about 14 miles.
The Point Robinson Lighthouse is appreciated by landlubbers, too. Mary Matthews is the director of Island Landmarks, a local preservation organization whose goal is to ensure the future of the island's historic buildings.
I think the Northwest has been a little bit behind the East Coast and Midwest just because everything out here is so much later. I mean, we have log cabins here that date to the 1880s. So it's hard for people in the Northwest to consider something being historic. But some of the best lighthouses were designed by very prominent architects. I think that people come to the islands because they want to live in a beautiful place. They want to live where there's still some character, where there's still some integrity. And I think people are going to work to save that.
St. Patrick was a gentleman. He came from decent people. Oh, way Holloway, Bill Holloway Joe. He taught the Irish boys the joy of tippling all the whiskey. Oh, way Holloway, Bill Holloway Joe. Shanties were done to do various work that had to be done by a group of sailors together. There were rowing shanties, there were capstan shanties. Each one has its own rhythm and needs to be sung, if you're doing the work, in rhythm with the work.
John Burke and the Vashon Island Maritime Heritage Society keep alive the traditional boat handling skills of the age of exploration.
This is a ship's tender. This boat is essentially a copy of one of the vessels used in exploration here in the late 18th century. And Peter Puget, who was with the Vancouver expedition, actually explored everything from Bainbridge Island south down through the Narrows and into Olympia, which is a lot of waterways, in 7 days in 2 ship's boats very similar to this. And without any kind of navigational aid such as lighthouses, it was very difficult to maneuver in those days. A small boat is a little bit easier because if you happen to bump into the shore, you probably haven't done a whole lot of damage to yourself. People think that if you're close to the land, you're safer than if you're out in the middle of the ocean. But nobody ever hits anything out in the middle of the ocean. You hit things when you get close to land.
The Point Wilson Lighthouse sits on a spit of sand that sweeps out from the western shore of Puget Sound, near Port Townsend, Washington. Due to shoreline erosion, the existing lighthouse is the second to be built on the site. The graceful tower was built in an octagonal shape to reduce wind pressure on the structure. Point Wilson marks the entrance to Admiralty Inlet, the main channel into Puget Sound. The Admiralty Head Lighthouse on Whidbey Island once marked the eastern side of the inlet. By 1922, the advent of steamships rendered the light obsolete. The lighthouse shares the bluff on which it stands with an old military fort. The 10-inch guns that once protected these shores are on display for visitors to Fort Casey State Park. The lighthouse is no longer needed by ships, but draws visitors like ants to a picnic.
Welcome to Admiralty Head Lighthouse. What I'm going to talk to you about today is why this lighthouse is here and how the old navigators back in the sailing days used lighthouses to find out where they were. So this is a big, beautiful building, but what good was it to the navigator out there in a sailing ship?
Kathleen Walter's 6th grade class is visiting the lighthouse for a history lesson.
We want them to have an opportunity to experience some of the history of Puget Sound and their local region. It's also an opportunity to see kind of living history and to have a time to touch the guns and to look at what people looked at many, many years ago. And they sit and they listen and they look, and they're just, even kids that can't sit still are just fascinated and enthralled with the story. It becomes more real for them.
It was a place for sailing ships to sail towards. They would sail towards this light until they got to a certain point. Then when they got some wind, they could sail on south down into the Puget Sound area.
Melanie Ford is an historical interpreter at the park.
The maritime history, military history, it has everything that's been the American experience has happened, and that's why this area was made into the first National Historic Reserve in our nation. But Admiralty Head Lighthouse is definitely the largest and the biggest tourist attraction on the Whidbey area. The architect was Carl Lick, and he worked with the Army Corps of Engineers, and his motto was "Build 'em stout." And so he felt if you were going to build it, you build it and make it stay or have it last. They decided to build a Spanish style out of brick with stucco over top. The walls are 18 inches thick. It would withstand a great deal. It took a good 2 years to build the structure, and it is definitely one of the most beautiful lighthouses I've seen. It's just something inside of us that draws us to these places, just like the light did originally. And although lights may not be in a lot of them, the light is still shining in us where we see them and we light up.
Do you want to hand me a piece too? Sure. This is our first day to be open in the spring, so that's why we have a party today.
Mukilteo, Washington is on the mainland, just north of Seattle. The Mukilteo Historical Society has adopted the lighthouse here. Mim Laurie is the group's president.
It is one of the few lighthouses that's in the area that you can get to. Most of them are in such remote areas, and this one is right in a place where everybody can come. We have tourists from all over the world, all over the world. It's amazing to me. The city has spent a great deal of money with the Port Commission to restore the houses. We want to restore the inside of the houses too, and so it just takes a little while, that's all. We need a few more coats of paint, but we'll get there.
I never did landscapes or animals or people. I've always drawn something with walls. If it's got walls, chances are I can draw it.
Artist Bev Schreiber is a lighthouse fan and a member of the Mukilteo Historical Society.
What I will do is a pencil sketch of it, then pen and ink, watercolor, and then pen and ink. And within the coloring itself, it's when you start putting the shadowing that the piece just really comes alive. It's just day and night, and that is, for me, is the really fun part, is to put the shadowing in. And when I got into the lighthouses and the stories were so fascinating, I figured I couldn't just draw this picture anymore. I wanted to include some information on it. And that is one thing I really pride myself on, is that the colors that you see and the information that you read are accurate as of when I did the print. I would like to think that people who are purchasing the prints, if they have not visited the lighthouses that they've seen, will be spurred to go and do that. Part of what I've enjoyed is having people come back and say, you know, I had no idea that these things were so neat until, you know, I saw your work and I started to read about these. You always would like to think that you influence people to the better, and if you can get more history buffs out there, good for us.
The chain of islands, known as the San Juans, stretches north from Puget Sound into the waters of Canada. The many islands and bays are a mecca for pleasure boaters and island hoppers. During the summer months, a system of ferries brings tourists by the boatload to the island paradise. San Juan, the largest of the islands, includes the town of Friday Harbor, a favorite destination for shopping and dining. The rest of the island offers a variety of activities. The Lime Kiln Lighthouse is one favorite destination. Named for the lime quarries on the island, Lime Kiln was the last major lighthouse established in Washington state. The light in the tower continues to guide ships along the island's western shore. The lighthouse building serves as the home of the Whale Research Center. Richard Osborne is the center's director.
Well, the lighthouse is an incredible facility, being as close to the shoreline as it is. It's an ideal location. This particular shoreline is a place where the currents coming in from the ocean through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, they tend to blow all the organisms coming in the strait right up along the shoreline. And so fish, birds, marine mammals all end up getting stacked along this shoreline. And so that's what makes it such a great place to observe them. The orcas are resident here. They stay within about 200 miles of this lighthouse all year round. This population of orcas is probably the most thoroughly studied orcas in the world, and the most urban orcas. They're the closest to people, large populations of people. From mid-May through June, the whales are here just about every day, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. Well, we have underwater microphones set up along the coastline, and then we transmit the signals to the lighthouse here. You get to where you can recognize the calls. What we really want to do is to be able to sort out conversations between individual whales. So if one whale vocalizes, we want to know the identity of the other whale that vocalized back and try to actually follow exchanges. This is truly an ideal situation for this kind of research. And it's good because we can share the information with the general public.
In the mid-1800s, the coast of the Pacific Northwest was a pristine wilderness of rugged, forested highlands and desolate beaches scoured by crashing surf. It was an uncharted and dangerous shoreline. At best, only the major headlands or capes were known to a handful of adventurers. Lighthouses were well established along the East Coast and on the Great Lakes long before the Lighthouse Board considered marking the new territories of Oregon and Washington. As ship traffic increased each year, cargoes and lives were lost. The need for lighthouses became obvious.
When the resource potential of the Pacific Northwest became known, Congress became increasingly generous in funding aids to navigation.
Lighthouse historian Stephen Becker.
The plan was to create a series of interlocking light structures along the shoreline so that any mariner 12 to 14 miles out to sea, when looking toward shore, would be able to espy a major light on a headland. Each station would then have a unique signature, and a mariner would get a clear read on where they were located. The federal government published the Coast Pilot, which was a guide to let mariners get their fix or location on a station. The guide included a visual that gave a profile of the headland. There was also a description of the sweep of the light and the seconds between the flashes. So these concentric connections along the shoreline were absolutely critical for maritime commerce. The coast of Oregon and Washington was particularly dangerous in the early decades because that was still the era of sail travel. And when vessels were powered by sails with no steam assist, they were completely vulnerable to the falling of the wind or the push of a great current or even getting just lightly grounded at the change of the tides. So that if a mariner risked going in a schooner to an estuary, at any moment the wind could die, and with no steam tug to assist them, all was lost or all was in peril.
The entrance to the mighty Columbia River is one of the most treacherous of all river mouths. The history of coastal navigation is punctuated by the names of the ships lost here.
The worst place to be is in the curl itself, and that generally is where boats get damaged and people get hurt.
The men and women of Coast Guard Station Cape Disappointment are the official guardians of the Columbia River Bar. Bart Pope is a senior surfman.
I think Columbia River, as far as the bar goes, it's noted as probably as one of the roughest areas in the world. You have 3,500 miles of unobstructed waves coming one direction, you have an outgoing current from the bar going the other way, which at times can create significant breaks or wave conditions. A rough day, you have anywhere between 15 to 20 foot. You may get a break straight in off your bow. Another one that's starting to break on your side. Another one that's breaking off your starboard side. It's just kind of coming at you from 3 different directions. And when it's like that, pretty much the only thing you can do is just eat it. I don't think anybody does it for the money, because it's not like the highest paying job in the world. I think, moreover, that people do it because they like the satisfaction of helping somebody else out that's in trouble, being able to save a life here or there. It's not your mundane 8 to 5 job.
The Columbia River remains a vital commercial artery for the Pacific Northwest. Cargoes can be carried well into the interiors of Washington and Oregon on this marine highway. Because of the importance of this waterway, the Lighthouse Board chose Cape Disappointment as the site for the first lighthouse on the northwest coast. The masonry tower is 5 feet thick at the base and 2.5 feet thick at the top. It was built to last and has faithfully served since 1856. The decorative eagle head water spouts drain condensation from the lantern room ceiling. Visitors to Fort Canby State Park can see the lighthouse and share the view. The building itself is not open to the public.
We're at the extreme south end of Washington State. Cape Disappointment Lighthouse is 2 miles from here, and that makes Cape Disappointment and North Head the 2 closest operating lighthouses in the United States.
Barb Cashel is an authority on North Head Lighthouse. She's lived here for 13 years.
Cape Disappointment was built first. It was finished in 1856, and it was quickly realized that because of the shape of the coastline, that ships coming from the north cannot see the Cape Disappointment light. So in 1898, a second light, North Head, was placed to mark the entrance to the Columbia River. Starting in 1898, when North Head was finished, they both operated simultaneously, as they do continue to do so today. North Head is one of the windiest places in the United States, and the highest recorded wind here was 160 miles per hour, at which point the wind gauge broke. One thing people ask a lot is, I've been to Cape Disappointment, is it worth it to go to North Head or vice versa? And a lot of times people think, well, when you've seen one lighthouse, you've seen them all. And that's clearly not the case, because they're two very distinct, different towers. North Head Light Station is unique in the fact that it's a complete light station. It not only has the light tower, it also has the original oil houses, the original lightkeepers' residences, and the chicken shed and the barn. And that's not very common in the U.S. With automation, a lot of outbuildings were torn down. There are two keepers' dwellings. There's the head residence dwelling and the assistant keeper's duplex. That was fairly typical. If there was room, the lighthouse service would provide a separate residence for the head lightkeeper, and the assistants usually had to share accommodations. And as you went down the totem pole in order of rank, you would usually climb higher and higher in the house. So the third or fourth assistant keeper would have a few rooms in the attic.
For the complete lighthouse experience, the lightkeeper's quarters at North Head can be rented for up to 10 days at a time. Barb and her husband Gary, a ranger at the park, live in the assistant keeper's duplex.
We can see the beacon as it sweeps through the trees from our master bedroom window. So I go to sleep counting in my head 1 flash, and then 12 seconds later there should be another flash, and that's how I know the light's working, and then I can go to sleep.
Tillamook Rock Lighthouse is one of the most isolated places on the entire West Coast. Nicknames like Terrible Tilly and Alcatraz hint at the lifestyle of lightkeepers here. Battered by wind, rain, and monstrous waves, duty at this lighthouse was extreme in every way. Just setting foot on Tillamook Rock was an event. Without a dock or suitable landing, all men and supplies were hoisted onto the rock by a cable rigged from a derrick. Except for infrequent visits by the supply boat, contact with the outside world was non-existent. The isolation of life on Tillamook tested each keeper stationed here. Some found it unbearable and had to be removed. Others enjoyed the seclusion of life on the rock. One keeper was so attached to the rock that he refused to go ashore when his time for leave came. The last head keeper at Tillamook was Oswald Alec, who served here for nearly 20 years. Jim Gibbs recalls his time on the rock.
When I went out there in the 1940s to become a keeper, I was a relatively young man. It was definitely an experience that was really a complete change for me, leaving the so-called populated world and going out onto a rock where the only place you could walk was around the perimeter of the lighthouse. I thought when I got out there that was the worst place in the world that anybody could be, and I used to think of every way I could think of to escape from the rock. But the longer I stayed there, communed with God and nature, the better I got to like it. And I was very sorry when they removed me from the rock, because it was a vital experience in my life, something I came to really enjoy.
Jim's years on Tillamook Rock made a lasting impression. He has since authored 19 books on lighthouses and maritime history. His home on the Oregon coast is a monument to his love of the sea.
Ever since I was a kid, I always had interest in maritime commerce. As far as the lighthouse is concerned, I always said when I was out at Tillamook that someday I'd like to have my own lighthouse on the Oregon coast. I guess it kind of gets in your blood after you've been a lighthouse keeper before the days of automation. You got to like that kind of life, and you'd like to continue it in your private life. Our lighthouse is located on the north slope of Cape Perpetua, and Cape Perpetua has the steepest rise of any cape along the Oregon coast directly from the beach. So we thought that this would be a very logical place to have a lighthouse. I don't say that ships couldn't operate without it. It's a fun thing, and I find that the commercial fishermen especially are very grateful to have the light shining at night. They still like the idea of having a lighthouse along the shore.
Heceta Head on Oregon's central coast was named for a Portuguese explorer who sailed under the flag of Spain. The beautifully situated Heceta Head Lighthouse exudes an aura of mystery and romance that has rolled down through the centuries like the drifting fog that frequently embraces the old tower. Heceta House, the Queen Anne-style assistant keeper's quarters, is on the National Register of Historic Places. It has been fully restored by loving local lighthouse enthusiasts. The Coos County Historical Museum and private citizens have donated turn-of-the-century furniture, and the house is operated as a highly popular bed and breakfast inn, known for its 7-course breakfast. The charming resort town of Newport is situated on Oregon's Yaquina Bay.
Welcome. Welcome to the Yaquina Bay Lighthouse, the oldest building in Newport. I'd like to invite you in. We'll go into the parlor.
Marie Schinberg is the tour coordinator at the Yaquina Bay Lighthouse.
When the lighthouse opened in 1871, the lighthouse keeper and his family moved here from Alaska. We do know that they moved here with 8 children, and a 9th was born after they moved into this lighthouse. This, I think, is one of the most interesting rooms in the whole house. I just can't imagine cooking for a large family on a stove like this. And this is a very unusual item that they might have had in their kitchen. And a lot of people guess that it's either a cradle for a tall, skinny baby, or it could be a trough for feeding the family goats. But it really is a cottage cheese maker. We suppose that probably that could have been a great kid's job, because you could sit and you could churn with one hand and you could rock the milk with the other.
The lighthouse was built in 1871, but its light shone for only 3 years. A harbor light, it was built to mark the entrance to the safe anchorage at the mouth of the Yaquina River. The hazardous shoreline required something a little more powerful. The Seacoast Light at Yaquina Head was established just 3 miles to the north. This tallest lighthouse on the Oregon coast cast its beam 19 miles from the lantern room atop a 93-foot masonry tower.
We have a great lighthouse out here, and it turns out to be located just a few feet from some of the best tide pools in the state. So it's neat to have both a lighthouse and the tide pools all located within a very, very small area. We only have about 100 acres out here, but the diversity of life is just incredible.
Ed White is a marine biologist and nature interpreter at Yaquina Head. During the summer, he guides visitors to the intertidal zone just below the lighthouse.
Now, this is probably one of our two most common animals. We have a lot of barnacles, but these are actually mussels. The mussel beds support about 250 species of animals here on the Oregon coast. The sea stars come in and eat the mussels, the sea anemones will eat the mussels, and a lot of animals live underneath the mussels and use the mussels for shelter. The green sea anemone is another common animal we have out here. It's open like a flower, that's why they call it the sea anemone. If you reach down slowly, you can very gently touch a sea anemone, and by putting your finger alongside of it, and you can feel the tentacles actually pulling you in. Often you'll see migrating whales. We have orcas that come in here and feed from time to time, seals and marine mammals. We get over 20,000 nesting seabirds every year. Some of them even nest on the mainland here, which is really great for easy viewing.
During the days of manned lighthouses, keepers at Yaquina Head feasted on the abundance of seafood in the area.
This is very convenient, very close to the lighthouse. You can imagine some of the keepers could have walked right out of the doors of their homes. They had gardens up above, but when the tide came out, they could just climb down the cliff and actually come down here to eat. If we had a choice of walking all the way to Newport to get some supplies or going out on the point and fishing for a few hours, it was probably the best alternative.
The need for lighthouses is greatest when the weather turns foul. The Oregon coast is notorious for its winter storms. As it has for over a century, the Umpqua River Lighthouse casts an alternating red and white light out to sea, guiding mariners along Oregon's southern coast. The French-built first-order lens at Umpqua is a magnificent example of the largest lenses that were made for 19th century lighthouses. Countless revolutions of the massive glass took a toll on the drive mechanism. In 1983, the lens's chariot wheels failed. Rather than make repairs, the Coast Guard planned to replace the classic lens with a modern plastic beacon. Public outcry was heard loud and clear, and the original machinery was restored. Cape Blanco is the oldest working lighthouse in Oregon. Late one night in November of 1992, its 122-year career was almost prematurely ended. Thanks to the efforts of a local artisan, the original French-built Fresnel lens continues its service.
I can't help but be romantically attached to glass. I've been working with glass for, 40 years now, and I still love every minute that I've done it, and I love every piece of glass I've ever worked on.
Larry Harden is expert at fabricating precision glass optical instruments. This optics whiz has crafted countless lenses for the U.S. space program.
For its time period, it was truly state-of-the-art. It was manufactured in a way that today a lot of us still don't understand quite how they actually made it. It was assembled probably at the factory and originally in these large sections. You can see, if you look closely here, they're numbered like giant puzzle pieces. And I kind of marveled at how all these pieces and components actually got here to be assembled that way, because they had to be brought by ship and then ported up here by either mule or donkey or manpower somehow to be assembled. They had an oil lamp inside this, and to take advantage of it so that a very weak source could become a very directed beam out onto the horizon was an entirely new science at the time. and a really significant breakthrough.
After more than a century of service, the carefully crafted lens was nearly destroyed in one thoughtless moment. Vandals broke into the lighthouse and shattered parts of the irreplaceable lens. No one could repair it. That is, until Larry Hardin stepped forward.
Well, we replaced 7 pieces. There was the bullseye lens itself and one of the outer rings, and we replaced 5 of the other lower elements on the lens assembly down here. We had to completely remove one of these entire lower assemblies and take it to the shop so that we could carefully measure and remanufacture and fit the new elements back inside.
At his shop in Bandon, Oregon, Hardin and his associates recreated the lens parts.
We spent about 6 months looking for glass types, and I found that the latest Corning production of Pyrex was very, very close to the same color and appearance as the original soda lime glass that was in the lighthouse. So all these components that you see here are made of Pyrex, the same material that's used in pots and pans. There wasn't really a lot of new science to be learned, but what was new that we learned was that we didn't know how to make these. And the thing that amazed me was how accurate and detailed all of the little facets and shapes were. The actual lenses in the lighthouse itself had very crisp corners. The intersection of the prism tops and roofs were very sharp. What amazed me is how back then they could grind them that close. It was just like, wow, how did they do that? They didn't have this kind of machinery. Even now, I hate to admit that we just barely were able to duplicate the craftsmanship that was done over 100 years ago. It was really kind of warming and rewarding to see that it was still working and working well, and to see that it might go on for another 100 years.
The Coquille River Lighthouse marks the river entrance and the town of Bandon, Oregon. For many years, the lighthouse was a centerpiece of this port community. In 1939, the lighthouse was taken out of service. It marked the end of an era. The light was removed from the tower, and the keepers were relieved of their duties. An automated light on the end of the jetty could do the job at a fraction of the cost. Years of neglect took their toll on the vacant building. The lighthouse that once stood proudly at the entrance to the community was in ruins. Salvation came at the hands of the town of Bandon. The renovated lighthouse is again at the center of the community and an icon of local pride.
Lighthouses have become very, very popular over the last 4 or 5 years. Something that's coming back in. It's just part of our past that you'd like to bring forward again.
The light in the tower at Bandon is no longer needed, but the lighthouse itself continues to shine. Each Christmas, volunteers from the fire department become light keepers for a day.
There you go. Okay, go over. Now trade again. Trade again.
We got the equipment, we got the manpower, we're all volunteers. You know, somebody's got to do it.
It kind of starts the Christmas spirit in it, because after a while, you know, you get tired of going shopping and you look at the bills and you go, bah humbug. Well, this kind of helps you overcome some of the old bah humbug.
The lighthouses of the Pacific Northwest help tame the unforgiving coasts of Oregon and Washington. Under the care of a new generation of lightkeepers, they expand their role and are cherished reminders of our nation's seafaring past.
It's one of those things. The lighthouse is the symbol of the city.
Legendary Lighthouses, supported in part by a grant from Lighthouse Depot, your source for lighthouse collectibles, artwork, and decor, so that you may keep the legend alive. Lighthouse Depot store and catalog of Wells, Maine. And by the annual financial support of PBS viewers like you. Legendary Lighthouses, supported in part by a grant from Lighthouse Depot, your source for lighthouse collectibles, artwork, and decor, so that you may keep the legend alive. Lighthouse Depot store and catalog of Wells, Maine. And by the annual financial support of PBS viewers like you.